Hey, so I decided to do my assignment on John Foxx and the CR78, the Roland CR78. John Foxx was a musician from Britain in the active from the early 1970s until the mid 1980s. Then he took a break. He just came back not in the past few years making music again. Um, and the Roland CR78 is a early model drum machine. So basically, I'll just give a brief synopsis of John Foxx's career and some specs for the Roland CR78. So in the early 1970s, John Foxx was called, well, his name is Dennis Lee because that's his real name, Dennis Lee, but he was just graduating from art school. And he said that he felt like he could sense that music was about to take a turn, or maybe not take a turn, but the new genre was going to develop with electronic music, just because the technology was getting to the point where there was so much more possible, and they would be able to create sounds that people had never heard before. And he wanted to make music in that genre. So he began collecting primitive electronic music instruments, that were around England at that time in the 70s, and he searched for like-minded people that wanted to do the same kind of music and were inspired in the same way. He said that he felt like there was an ability to create a new perceptual universe, which is pretty grandiose, but just means again that you had the ability to make sounds that people hadn't perceived before. So anyway, he looked for people. He eventually found a group. They called themselves Tiger Lily. But after a couple of years of just touring around London, they changed their name and musical direction, because as it is oftentimes when you get together with other people, what ended up happening wasn't really what was intended immediately. They kind of ended up being like a glam rock, David Bowie kind of glam rock, but that was very popular at that point. So it was... They decided to change the name. They changed the name to Ultravox with an exclamation point that they later dropped. But Ultravox, and they changed the musical direction and got a lot more emphasis on the interaction between electronic music and live instrumentation and the contrast that you can find there. Punk music was getting really big at the time. John Foxx said that they met with some kind of, like, with a little bit of not backlash, but people kind of were like, why they wanted to use electronic music. That seems so strange, and people want to listen to the Sex Pistols and that kind of extreme kind of music. But it was a lot more laid back and more experimental and weird. But they went with it anyway, and actually they were quickly signed because they were so different from what was happening there that they ended up being signed, and actually recorded their first album, which was self-titled. It was produced by the band with also Steve Lillywhite, and Brian Eno also was producer on it. I know someone else is doing their assignment on Brian Eno. So after moderate mainstream success, especially in North America, where they weren't really well known or known even very well at all, but in Europe they got pretty big. They had a couple of singles that charted anyway. While recording the album Systems of Romance, John Foxx decided he didn't want to be in the band anymore. He didn't like the touring lifestyle of sex, drugs, rock and roll kind of lifestyle. He said that wasn't really for him. That's not what he wanted to do. So he quit the band to pursue solo efforts. Basically, he's quoted saying that he told the band, "You can keep the name, I'm keeping the drum machine." And that drum machine that he used with them and that he used ever since then was the Roland CR78. Now, the CR78, it was a very primitive drum machine. Like I said, I think it was originally produced in 1978. And though it was very restrictive by our standards today. Like, you couldn't do anything near what you can today, obviously. It was a really important leap forward in drum machine technology for that time, at least. It was a big change. I'll explain why. The machine had all analog drum voicings, and obviously because they sounded nothing like real instrumentation like we can today. We can get samples and that kind of thing that can sound real. That's something that made it very unique for the time. Now we're used to it, so it's hard to imagine, but just, you know, a low frequency pulse for a kick instead of, you know, actually hearing the flap was of the kick pedal on the kick drum. That was pretty different for the time, and it, you know, was a leap forward for music, definitely, though drum machines had already been using that kind of sounds obviously for a while. Now it had all usual drum sounds, meaning that it had like a, you know, a cymbal, hi-hat, toms, kick drum and everything, but obviously, like I said, they didn't sound like anything, but it did have all of those things listed as options for you. Now, an interesting piece of it was that the microprocessor that was in it was actually an early Intel microprocessor, which is kind of interesting because obviously we all know Intel processors right now, or nowadays. So the CR70 was factory programmed. It had 34 preset rhythms, but more importantly, the biggest thing about it, especially for Roland, but for technology and music at the time, it had 4 programmable memory locations, which the user could create and store their own sounds. Which before, obviously, if you found a good sound that you like this guy fiddling back here, say it wasn't the CR78, you had to write a patch, like a patch description of everything that you had done, because you couldn't just save it. You had to list it, so then you would have papers that you would have to look through to get sounds, and you can imagine even like playing live would have been pretty difficult, or not as impressive to see a guy up there leafing through pages trying to find the right patch. Anyway, so that was a big deal. And also the knobs and twiddler-dees and twiddly-doos on the faceplate included a balance between treble and bass sound, or you could cancel sound altogether, or adjust volume. Interestingly, also ring modulation. You could add ring modulation to the beats that you made, though they called it metal beat. They didn't call it ring modulation, which Foxx actually named a song on his album, his debut album, debut solo album, I should say, Metamatic. It was actually called Metal Beat. And also Virgin Records, they used Metal Beat Records as his imprint name, and he used it on every album that he made with them while he had a contract with them. Okay, so that's brief. It's over 5 minutes, but that's a pretty brief explanation of both. John Foxx and the CR78, a machine and a man that both helped to define each other, both ways. Thank you.